Whistler in the Fog. This is the first of a few creepy family stories I want to share here. This story was told to me by my grandmother many times during my childhood. I guess I was a weird kid, because I loved to hear her creepy stories before bed. This story takes place in 1955 to 1956. When my grandma Patsy was a teenager, around 15 or 16 years old, her family lived in a small neighborhood in Fremont, California. Her older sister Susan had already moved out and was married with kids, and one week, Susan had decided to visit the family. While Susan was visiting, Patsy had agreed to babysit for the neighbors one evening. Her own parents and brother went out for the evening, leaving Susan at the other house alone. Patsy walked across the adjoining side yard to the neighbor's house, gave the kids dinner, put them to bed. In the living room, she put on a record and was dancing, and generally messing around and having fun to the music. During the evening, a thick fog had rolled in, not uncommon in this area. As the music played, Patsy thought she heard a low whistle, 2 high notes followed by one long low note. She turned the music down, and heard the whistle again. For a moment she froze, not sure what to do. The curtains in the living room were all open, and outside, all she could see was a fog swirling around the streetlights. She turned the music off, turned off the lamps, and quickly closed the curtains. The whistle came again. Patsy got the courage to peer out the window into the darkness, and could just barely see the silhouette of a man sitting on a tree stump between the 2 homes. He whistled again. She jumped up from the window in a panic and called her sister Susan next door. Susan heard the whistle as well, and they decided to try to scare the man off. They both went out the front door and met on the sidewalk between houses about 10 feet from where the whistling man sat in the fog. Susan pretended to give Patsy something she'd forgotten, a book or something like that, and was loudly talking about her husband Alan being asleep, but that he was going to wake up soon to go to work. Neither of them dared to look at the man in the fog, and each quickly returned to the houses they had come from. As Patsy closed the door, she heard the whistle again. Patsy and Susan both hunkered down in fear for the rest of the night. After several hours, the whistling man eventually left, and when my great-uncle came home, he took out a gun and was so nervous he shot a hole in the kitchen floor. They never found out who that man was or why. He was whistling at them all night. The Foggy Back Road. Here goes. I was walking home at 1 a.m. on a Sunday morning. It was the transition between autumn and winter, cold, but no snow or rain, etc. Just cold and overcast. This night, it had gone cold to the point where it was foggy as well. All was silent, and for whatever reason, there wasn't any cars around. The streetlights were very dim as well. I had 2 paths to get home. The route with streetlights that feels a bit safer but is really long, or the back road that doesn't have any lights but is only about a 5-minute walk versus 10 to 15 to 20 minutes. Me being my lazy self, I decide on the latter of the two, the 15 to 20 minute one, the unlit route. About halfway through I hear footsteps behind me. Now, a fair distance away but loud enough to hear nonetheless. I decide to look back but see nobody behind me due to the fog. I decided to wait, and saw a dark silhouette of a woman walking. She seemed young. From what I could see, I'd say she was mid-20s. I thought nothing of her and turned back and moved on. Suddenly, I hear her footsteps speed up. Being slightly paranoid, I increase my walking speed a little bit. She continues to walk even faster. I look back and she breaks into a full-blown sprint towards me. I could see an intersection ahead and was about 200 feet from the road, which I crossed to get to the condo I live in. Adrenaline kicks in and I sprint all the way to the intersection without looking back. Once I got to the intersection, I stopped, out of breath. I looked back to see nothing but fog. The woman had disappeared. All of a sudden, from within the fog, I hear a loud, cackling laugh, similar to one you'd hear from a witch in a movie, and she just continues to laugh and laugh and laugh, not stopping. I get spooked and J-sprint across the road and quickly run into my home, which also happens to look out towards the street she was at. lock all the doors and windows, and look out of my living room window. There was nothing. There was nothing but fog. I continued to sit there for a few minutes until I see the woman again, slowly walking out of the fog. She couldn't see me since I was looking from in between the blinds, and it was dark outside. She stands in the middle of the street that she was on. No cars around, and looks around to her left and her right. It seemed like she was looking for me. All of a sudden, something I didn't expect to happen at all happened. She broke down into tears. She fell to her knees and started to sob, as if she were extremely hurt or disappointed that she could not find me. She sat there on her knees and sobbed constantly for 5 minutes. Afterwards, when she calmed down, she just got up and left, still quietly whimpering as she walked down the cross street away. 3 weeks later, the same situation occurs. I'm walking along the same road, same weather, fog and all. The exact same thing as the last encounter with the woman happens again, except this time I stopped across the street, turned and looked back towards the fog. Soon enough, she walked out and stared at me from across the road. After about 2 minutes of us just looking at each other, she turns around and walks back into the fog. I turn away and quickly go home. I look out the window again to see if she's there anymore, but she wasn't. I heard the same horrible sobbing a few seconds after, though, from within the fog. It spooked me, because the crying wasn't just a bit of emotional hurt. It sounded as if she was crying over something majorly painful in her life, both times. Like a murdered husband, or if her house had been burned to the ground. It sounded as if her life were ruined, both times. It's been almost a year since both these occasions happened, and I haven't walked down that road in the dark again, for fear of seeing her again. But the question still sits in the back of my head. Who was she? And why was she doing this? What was she crying over? Face on a foggy August night. This is my very first post on Reddit. I've been reading Let's Not Meet for a few days and was trying to think of an encounter I experienced that was creepy enough to include. Perhaps this will. In summer of 2012, my boyfriend and I went to a beach close to us in coastal New England. It was the evening, and we walked on the beach for a while, walked through the arcade and boardwalk, and decided to go for a drive up the coast. As it was early August, it was extremely humid, foggy night. We pulled off on one of those small parking lots that dot the coastal road. It was around 10 p.m. at night, and no one was parked there, so we thought it wouldn't be terrible. We made our way to the back seat and fooled around for a while. We didn't have sex because we were already too paranoid to do that in case we were caught. No charges of semi-public nudity for us. We had finished our fun, and were relaxing, basking in the romantic afterglow. I had my head resting on my boyfriend's chest and shoulders when I looked up to kiss him on the cheek. In the edge of the fogged-up window, I saw a face staring intently at us. Pressed up against the glass, I screamed. My boyfriend turned his head in the direction, saw the face, and did a bit of a scream himself. We saw the figure run away from the car, over the sand dune, and onto the beach. I felt terrified, and immediately violated, and decided that in that moment, I would never be the same. Not true, but in the moment, it was quite scary. In a rush of adrenaline, my boyfriend wanted to chase after him and yelled, "I'll get you, motherfucker!" Into the dark. I pleaded with him to get back into the car, not to do anything rash, and to lock the doors, and go find a police station to report this incident. We asked a man who had recently pulled into that same small parking lot sometime during our rendezvous, probably for some night fishing, if he had seen anyone run onto the beach. He had, but couldn't tell where he could have gone. We drove to the nearest police station and just filed a report that some random man was either purposely peeping into cars of strangers to scare them or to get some kicks. They said they'll let the patrol know. Perhaps it was a rascally teenager, or perhaps it was someone with the worst intentions. We drove home in the fog, very shaken, and I was convinced there must have been some way he could have been videotaping us, because his face seemed to have a halo of artificial light around it, but I'm sure he wasn't. It would have been hard to see anything. We haven't parked and fooled around anywhere since. Jane in the Fog. Long-time lurker here, etc., etc. Now, been trying to think of any encounters with creepy individuals for a while now, and a memory has come to me at last, so hey, might as well post. This happened when I was around 12 years old, while traveling a stretch of road between a large Irish town and a not-so-large Irish town with my mother and niece, 11 years old at the time. My niece and I were buckled up and back. My mother was driving, and aside from the fact that the weather was eerie as hell, densely foggy, with that almost gaseous drivel you get sometimes, nothing untoward had occurred. So about 3/4 of the way to this town, still driving in dense fog, we see roadwork signs ahead, meaning all traffic had to squeeze through a gap, not much wider than a car on one side of the road. As we approach this gap, my mother practically slams on the brakes. This figure, completely out of nowhere, had staggered out of the fog onto the main road and just stood there, directly in line with the gap. She, as we could see it was a woman now, let's pretend her name was Jane to make this easier to type, wanders forwards towards the car, looking awfully disoriented. Now bear in mind, this is a mother with two young enough teens, so she's obviously a bit sketchy about this individual blocking the road and approaching the car in a fairly isolated area in dense fog. So Jane wanders around to the side of the door across from my mother and pulls it open, and I do believe my mother would have locked it beforehand or kept driving had she expected the woman to do this. But it was such a sudden movement that none of us could really have predicted it. So Jane sits into the car, this kind of faraway look in her eye, wearing a fluorescent red rain jacket, and places this plastic bag awkwardly onto the floor. My niece and I are exchanging glances, and I recall my mother politely but firmly asking her to get out of the car, please. So Jane closes the door and refuses, and I recall her saying something along the lines of, "No, you have to take me into town," as though it were an obvious fact that she was surprised we weren't aware of. So my mother berates her mildly about wandering out in front of traffic, stating that you'd have to be mad to do this in this weather, and Jane responds with, and I quote, "I know. Not sorry, not normal, just agreed. I know." So we aren't far from town, and my mother decides to drive on. We'll drop Jane off, and we'll be fine. So we're driving off, and my mother is actually cautiously questioning Jane about what she thought she was doing, with Jane just continually insisting in this blank monotone voice, "You just need to drop me into town," all the while staring blankly out into the fog. My niece and I are obviously quite spooked out by this point, unsure if you all know that feeling where someone is just giving off creepy vibes. Like, you can't put your finger on it, but something is definitely wrong here. So my mother glances back briefly, checking if we were fine, and we sheepishly confirm as much. But no sooner have we spoken than Jane whips her head around wildly, as if something's been her. I kid you not, it looked like she genuinely hadn't even noticed we were in the back seat at all. Might as well have just been Jane and my mother for all she was concerned. She spent a good 5 to 10 seconds eyeing my niece before staring directly at me for at least as long, fingers grasping her plastic bag, the contents of which I'll never know, her eyes boring into mine with a genuinely uncomprehending look on her face, as though I had suddenly sprouted wings or told her she was on Saturn or something like that. So she slowly, eyes not even leaving me, till her head was fully around, turned back to her listless stare out the front window, and the drive continues as normal. Well, as normal as it can get. None of us at all opting to further continue any type of a conversation with her. with Jane. We're approaching the town in question, in which we do not live, I might add. We take a turn just before the bridge into the town. My mother explains calmly to Jane that we're dropping her off at the bridge, and she can walk in. It's literally 2 minutes into the center of the town from this bridge, but Jane is furiously shaking her head. No! No! You can't drop me here. Again, it is that tone that although we're idiots and it's blatantly obvious, we couldn't possibly drop her off here. My mother asks why, and in a faraway tone receives, "You're just gonna have to drop me into town." I'll mention, it wasn't as though she was being rude with these statements. Not intentionally anyways, you know? She just sounded genuinely confused that we were questioning her commands to drop us into town. It sounded like she thought we had missed some serious reason as to why we just had to drop her straight into town, and she couldn't figure out why we were all so stupid. Anyways, rather than arguing, likely uselessly with Jane anyways, my mother crosses the bridge, drives into the square, and lets Jane go. After a few awkward seconds of Jane glancing around, she grasps her bag against her, pulls the door open, gives me and my niece one final confused eyeballing session, and stumbles out. It's raining heavy now, but of course, Jane doesn't put the hood on her raincoat up. She just wanders almost aimlessly off into the distance. Car door still hanging wide open. No explanation, no thank you, no voice goodbye, nothing. Just gone. Now, some of you are likely going to comment that Jane probably had some issues with her mental health, and that's entirely, completely likely. But I'd just like to reaffirm the gut feeling of wrong permitting from this woman. It felt as though she really shouldn't have been there, wandering there, on that lonely road in the late winter evening. And after a brief three-way debate on the woman after her departure, I'll admit it was a cold, uncomfortable, and still faintly eerie ride home, the last few dozen miles in the fog. I know not what brought Jane to that patch of road miles from anywhere that evening, if she was mentally capable of being out by herself. What put her in such a lost and confused state of mind? If she was indeed in need of help, serious help, mental help, or actually be in a case of her being in danger, I do not know. What or who had landed this clearly confused woman out in the middle of absolutely nowhere? I don't know. These questions I nor you shall never know the answers to. But I can say for a certainty, Jane is likely still out there. And I just hope to hell that I, or mine, don't pick her up again.